SEP FanFic Readings presents Thanks to the Photographs by Unstable Hufflepuff. Chapter 21. Join the Club. The second pansy was out the door later that night. Draco swept Hermione up into his arms and carried her giggling into the bedroom. The entirety of her living quarters had been redone in pale blues and creamy whites. The furniture was surprisingly sophisticated for something Pansy had helped select, though that was mostly due to the fact that Hermione downright refused to let her make any of her final decisions. Draco liked the way that Pansy had a new money sort of style, which Hermione didn't fully understand, but she knew Pansy would throw a fit if she heard. Pansy had come along on her shopping trip to offer a second opinion that went ignored. She was really just moral support. The little nook where the table originally sat was now home to 2 cream reading chairs with a small table between them. The old sofa had been replaced with a muted gray one that had a blue detailing that matched the decorative pillows. The coffee table was what Pansy called Queen Anne style, and there was a plush ottoman on the opposite side of it, facing the sofa. Beneath it was the sort of rug that one could not drink red wine anywhere near. A new wooden breakfast table that had been stained white sat near the entrance. It had 4 chairs with gray upholstery and a vase of white tulips as a centerpiece. According to Pansy, every table required a centerpiece. Photographs taken throughout Hermione's life were both hung on the walls and propped up on the bookshelf, which had been charmed white to match the new decor. Photographs of herself and her parents from when she was younger. Photographs of she, Harry, and Ron during their time at Hogwarts. One of Hermione, Ginny, and Luna, lounging on a grassy lawn near the Burrow. And one of Hermione and Neville, taken at the 3 Broomsticks the year they had returned to Hogwarts to finish their studies. A painting Pansy had found that depicted a couple sitting in a gondola, floating down a canal in Venice, had been placed on the wall next to the nook. All of Hermione's written plans were neatly stacked in a silver letter tray on the coffee table. Overall, the place looked very grown up, and Hermione was awfully proud of it. The bedroom was decorated in a similar fashion. An inane number of decorative pillows — Hermione suspected that Pansy added more when she wasn't looking — bounced off the bed when Draco tossed her on it. He quickly followed her, climbing over her body and kissing his way from her jawline to her collarbone. "I want to be in charge this time," he told her softly, and Hermione gave a long, suffering sigh. "I suppose I'll allow it." "Bitch," Draco muttered, sitting up to unbutton his shirt. "Draco was supposed to be making love here," said Hermione sternly. "You cannot call me a bitch. It ruins it." He rolled his eyes, still working off his shirt, and she flipped him over so that she was on top. "Hermione," he whined, as she pinned his hands to the bed and leaned down to nibble his ear. "You said I could be in charge." "You were taking too long," she said, momentarily releasing him to grab the hem of her dress and lift it over her body. She tossed it behind her. "I'm an impatient person, Draco, you know this." "I guess," he mumbled stubbornly, and then let out a tiny whimper when she ground her hips against him. She had his clothes off within 30 seconds, the rest of her own in 10 more, and 1 minute later the bed was rocking violently. It was a new bed, too. Pansy would be furious if they broke it the same day they bought it, but that was what magic was for. They'd already had to repair each of their beds at least once before. Hermione had Draco's hands pinned above his head once more, and her thighs were already burning. "Do you even know how to make love?" Draco asked her abruptly, and she froze. "You're supposed to look in my eyes." "Are you fucking serious right now?" "Yes, I'm fucking serious, Granger." "So we're back to Granger, are we?" "Only when I'm cross with you." "And you're cross with me because I'm not looking into your eyes?" "Yes," he said, pouting. "Very well, Your Highness," she said, sighing, and leaned down so that her face was hovering above his, her curls falling forward to act as a curtain around them. She began to move again, gentler this time. She had always thought his eyes were gray, but now she could see that there were tiny specks of blue in them. It reminded her of frozen glaciers. They were actually quite beautiful. She rotated her hips, and Draco moaned loudly, still holding her gaze. He seemed to be doing everything in his power to keep his head from falling back in pleasure. "You're so beautiful," he breathed, and it was truly remarkable that those words were able to make her blush when taking off her clothes in front of him hadn't. "You mean the world to me, Draco," she told him, gasping for breath. "Don't ever doubt that again." Draco made a sound that was half gasping and half laughter. He smiled brightly, so brightly that Hermione wondered if it were possible to be blinded by it. She increased her speed, grinding against him, and kissed him deeply, losing herself in him. His moans grew louder, and he had to drag his mouth away. "Let go of my hand," he demanded quickly, and she released one of his hands, planting her own on the pillow next to his head. He reached down between them, and her breath quickened. "Come on. Come on." Hermione lurched forwards, resting her forehead against his, her thighs trembling, and kissed him again. They moaned into each other's mouths as they both stilled, and she then collapsed against him, burying her face in his neck and catching her breath. Draco wrapped his now free arms around her, holding her close, and pressed a kiss to the side of her face, likely getting hair in his mouth, because her curls really were all over the place now. "And now," he said, panting, "we cuddle." "Cuddle?" she repeated incredulously. He pinched her arse and she squirmed, giggling. "Yes, after you make love, you cuddle. I don't make the rules, Hermione." Hermione hated it when Draco pretended not to know how to pronounce her name. She did. But this fact did nothing to help her at that moment. She returned his embrace, keeping her face hidden, fearful that one look at her would reveal everything. And it was almost like magic, that unexplainable feeling inside of her, of flutters in her stomach and warmth in her chest. The feeling that told her this was real, that this was unavoidable, that no matter what either of them said or did, no matter what happened, it wouldn't stop her from loving him. That feeling, it was fucking terrifying. But she was Hermione Granger, and she could do fucking anything. She drew a shaky breath and raised her head, carefully moving her hands to cup his face. "I have big plans for you and I, Draco Malfoy," she whispered, gently moving her thumbs across his cheekbones. "Does that frighten you?" "No," said Draco at once. His voice was hard and determined. "I just want you. I don't care about much else." Hermione took a deep breath to steady herself. "I can do this," she told herself firmly. "I can do it. I can do it. I can do it. I can do it." "Before we end today's lesson, there's something I'd like to speak with you about." Hermione moved away from the blackboard to perch on the edge of her desk, facing her Slytherin and Hufflepuff fifth years. "Next year, you will be moving on to NEWT classes." There were a few uneasy glances exchanged, though a couple of Slytherins straightened up in their seats, appearing almost excited. "Just like when you reached your third year, there will be new classes available to you," Hermione went on. "Assuming you have achieved an outstanding on both your potions and transfiguration OWLs, you will have the opportunity to also study alchemy. Likewise, if you have achieved an outstanding on both transfiguration and charms, you have the option to study magical theory. Who can tell me what the study of magical theory entails?" A Hufflepuff girl by the name of Bernice Benner raised her hand, and Hermione gestured for her to answer. "Magical theory is the study of nature of magic," she said, "such as how spells really work. Those who study it are known as magical theoreticians." "Very good. 5 points to Hufflepuff." Bernice beamed. "Can anyone name a famous magical theoretician?" Sasha Sykes of Slytherin raised his hand. "Yes, Sasha." "Gamp." "Isn't Gamp's Law?" said the girl beside him, Riley McIntyre, frowning. "Indeed," said Hermione, nodding. She hopped off her desk and began circling the classroom, her hands clasped behind her back. "Other notable magical theoreticians include Adelbert Waffling, who is responsible for the fundamental laws of magic, which we will be taking a closer look at after the holidays. There's Milford Quisling, who, in his treatise on spellcasting, claimed that magical energy could be drawn from within oneself when most in need, though most of this treatise was later discredited. Sal Croker, an unspeakable in our very own Department of Mysteries, studied the magic of time and drafted the legislation for the British Ministry of Magic's laws regarding time travel." There were impressed murmurs, and she smiled. "Have any of you ever wondered how magic really works? Have you ever wondered how it travels from within you and to your wand every time you cast a spell? What about how spells are created? I mean, really, you sit in a classroom 5 days a week for 7 years, learning all manner of spells that will help you when you leave here. Who creates those spells? How did they do it?" She halted when she reached the front of the room again. "This is what you will learn if you decide to take magical theory. Think on that. We'll discuss it further next class. Until then, you're dismissed." Hermione waited until the last student trickled out before leaving herself, making her way up to her quarters to change out of her robes and the dress she'd worn that day. She put on that same pair of denims Pansy despised, her leather boots, and a jumper that only had one sleeve, and that Harry would probably joke about as being half off. With her coat in one hand, she left to meet Draco. "You ready?" she called out as she entered his quarters on the floor above her own. They were as bare as hers had once been, but it made her quite appreciative of her recent remodeling. "Just about," Draco called back, his voice muffled from behind his bedroom door. He stepped out, buttoning up his coat. "All right?" "Mm-hmm." Hermione slipped on her own coat and linked her arm through his when he reached for her. "Come along. We've got a few errands to run before we're expected at the Potters." "Errands?" said Draco, shooting her a bewildered look. "What sort of errands?" "You'll see," was all she said on the matter. They walked down to the entrance hall, past the crowded great hall, and headed out the great oak front doors. It was fairly cold that day, and Draco complained about his socks getting wet as they trekked through the snow down to the front gates. With a graceful spin, Hermione apparated them both to an alleyway in the outermost part of London. "After those photographs came out," Hermione began as she led him out onto the sidewalk, "everyone in the Wizarding world, and even a great deal of people in the Muggle one, had an intimate idea of what I looked like. They saw parts of me, and up until that point, only one person had ever seen." She came to a stop outside a tattoo parlor, and Draco glanced up at the sign before turning back and gaping at her. "I'd like to change that." "So you're getting a tattoo?" "Yes. That way, they won't know everything. It'll be something just for you and I." Draco grinned stupidly, and she laughed, taking his hand and leading him inside. It was rather dingy-looking, and he appeared skeptical, but that was all part of the grunge aesthetic, so Hermione wasn't worried. A woman with short green hair, several face piercings, and a sleeve of colorful tattoos on each arm greeted them at the counter. "Hello," she said, closing the magazine she'd been idly flipping through. "Have you got an appointment?" "Yes, I believe we spoke on the phone," said Hermione. She'd actually called from a telephone booth while shopping with Pansy. It was strange not having a telephone anymore. "It's under Granger." The woman took a peek at the clipboard that rested on the countertop, then nodded upon seeing Hermione's appointment. She reached below, where they could not see, and grabbed a small stack of sketches to spread out on the counter. "I've drawn a few examples for you to choose from. Based on what you said on the phone, I tried to keep them all fairly simple. Take a look while I get set up a chair for you." "Thank you." Hermione went through the sketches, smiling a little to herself. She wanted it to be small and simple, nothing too bold, and these all fit that description. "What do you think, Draco?" "Depends on where you're putting it, I suppose." She unbuttoned her coat, revealing her torso, and pointed to a spot just above her left hip bone. "I like it," said Draco, smirking. He tapped one of the sketches with his finger, drawing her attention to it. "Maybe this one here. It's the smallest, and the design is a little more on the whimsical side, which makes it look more like a Patronus." He frowned, looking at her again, and added, "Assuming that's what it is, of course." "You would assume correctly." The woman returned and led them back to a black leather chair near the back of the shop. She had Hermione lie down, remove her coat, which she handed to Draco, and then lift her jumper and unbutton the top of her denims to roll them down an inch. Draco took a seat next to her and held her hand through the entire appointment, making idle chit-chat to distract her. Hermione may have experienced pain 1,000 times worse than this, but she still gripped his hand tight enough to make him grit his teeth. When it was finally over, just over an hour later, she glanced down at the tiny otter on her lower abdomen and nearly cried in relief. No one but Draco would know what she looked like with her clothes off now. She was grinning from ear to ear when they arrived at the Potter's home a short while later. Draco, however, was desperately trying not to panic. He had to release the hand of hers that he'd been holding to wipe it on the front of his coat because his palms had gotten so sweaty. "It'll be fine," Hermione told him quietly. "She's really very kind, Draco. You have nothing to worry about." He nodded, but she doubted he truly believed her. She raised a fist to knock regardless, but paused, glancing back at him. "Oh, and I should probably warn you, she looks quite a bit like her older sister. It can be a little jarring at first." The front door swung open before Hermione could knock, and they were faced with a much shorter individual than they had expected. "Hiya, Hermione!" Hermione giggled, catching Teddy as he flung himself into her arms. "Hello, Teddy." "Edward Remus Lupin, you do not answer the door yourself," said a stern voice. Not a moment later, Andromeda Tonks appeared at the end of the hallway, She was getting fairly old now, with a few more wrinkles on her face than there had been the last time Hermione saw her. "Sorry, dear. He was watching from the window. Couldn't stop him if I tried. How are you, Hermione?" "I'm just splendid, Andromeda," said Hermione cheerfully, stepping into the house with Teddy still wrapped up in her arms. "This one's getting a little big for me to carry, though." "You heard that, Teddy," Andromeda snapped, her hands on her hips. "Let Hermione go." "Fine," mumbled Teddy sulkily, sliding down to his feet. He turned to Draco, offering a bright smile. "Bye, Draco." Draco finally tore his eyes away from Andromeda, who he'd been staring at ever since she appeared, and smiled back at him. "Good evening, Teddy. It's nice to see you again." "Goodness, you look just like your father," gasped Andromeda, and Draco's head jerked back up to look at her again. She waved him closer. "Come here, dear. Let me have a good look at you." Draco hesitantly moved further into the house, and Hermione shut the door behind them. Andromeda cupped his face, narrowing her eyes. "But those are definitely your mother's eyes. A black family trait, that is. One of the better ones, I think. You're not mad as a hatter, are you?" "No, ma'am," said Draco uncomfortably. He flinched when she gave him a light smack on the cheek before releasing him and taking a step back. "Well, I'm sorry we've only met now," she said grimly. "But I suppose it's better late than never. Come along, then. Harry's got supper ready." And with that, she turned and strutted off down the hall, disappearing around the corner. Draco released the breath he'd been holding. "You were right," he muttered. "The resemblance is striking." "You'll get used to it," said Hermione. "Come on." She took both his and Teddy's hands and led the way into the kitchen. Harry was dishing out dinner, while Ginny finished setting the table. Albus was strapped into his high chair, tugging on strands of his own hair, while James stuck out his tongue at him from the next seat over. "Ah, Hermione," Ginny said, glancing up. "And you brought your pet ferret. How nice." "Lovely to see you too, Ginevra. How are you?" "Oh, you know. Al kept us up all night with his crying. He puked all over me about an hour ago. Had to change my top. And James learned a new curse word, courtesy of my brilliant husband stubbing his toe." "Fuck!" exclaimed James, beaming with pride. "That's my boy," grumbled Ginny, dropping into the seat on the other side of Albus with a tired sigh. Hermione, Teddy, and Draco sat opposite her, with Andromeda at one end of the table and Harry at the other. "Hey, Hermione, Malfoy." Harry gave Draco a brief nod, which was just about as good as could be expected. "We're having roast beef, mashed potatoes, and there are some green beans, too. If you don't like it, complain to someone else." "How are things at Hogwarts?" Ginny asked them a few minutes into the meal, simultaneously stabbing a piece of roast beef with her fork and lowering Albus's bib, which he had been hiding his face behind. "Good," said Hermione. "Nothing out of the ordinary, though I may have a biased opinion, considering all the things that happened when we were students." Ginny laughed. "Pansy and Hermione were on a rampage earlier this week," said Draco, taking a sip of his wine. "You should see Hermione's living quarters now." "Pansy Parkinson," said Harry, raising his eyebrow. At Draco's nod, he shook his head. "I don't know how you're friends with her, Hermione, especially after the way she used to treat you." Hermione felt Draco tense beside her. "Pansy has been a very good friend to me, Harry," she said in a no-nonsense tone. "In fact, she reminds me of Ginny sometimes." "Really?" Ginny frowned in thought. "Huh." "Anyway, her latest hobby is interior design," Hermione continued, cutting up her roast beef. "She was a great help." "Except when it came to decorative pillows," said Draco with a small chuckle. "Oh, God, I think she might have bought more when I wasn't paying attention. She tried to color-code my bookshelf." Harry snorted in amusement. "I mean, who color-codes their books? It's completely impractical." The rest of the meal followed without issue, if you didn't count James flinging mashed potatoes at Albus, until dessert was served. Harry had just turned on the Wizarding Wireless to Lee Jordan's regular broadcast, something he, Ron, Ginny, and Hermione used to do after dinner together, and Andromeda suddenly asked, "So it's true, then? The two of you are together?" "Well," Ginny began, smirking, but Hermione cut her off. "Yes," she said simply. Harry and Ginny looked up in surprise. Ginny gave her a look that plainly said, "We'll be discussing this later." "That's just lovely, I say," Andromeda told them, very matter-of-factly. She took a bite of her treacle tart and swallowed, smiling knowingly. "Though I'm sure your parents have had an awful lot to say about it, Draco." Draco nodded, but said nothing. He drained his glass of wine. "Well, if you're setting yourself up to be disowned," Andromeda went on ruefully, I suppose I should welcome you to the club. Our members are down to 1, so I could use the company. We meet on Tuesdays and Thursdays." "No, you don't," said Teddy, confused. "We went to the park on Tuesday, Granny." "It was a joke, dear." "Oh." "That's a good point, though," said Harry, looking from Andromeda to Draco. "What have your parents been saying about this, Malfoy?" "Well," said Draco, dabbing the corners of his mouth with his napkin, "I won't be going home for Christmas, Potter, I can tell you that much." Hermione reached across Teddy to take his hand. "We'll do something to celebrate ourselves." "You could always join Teddy and I if you'd like," said Andromeda, much to Draco's and Hermione's surprise. "This lot will be at the Burrow, and, like I said, I could use the company." "Yeah!" said Teddy excitedly, bouncing up and down in his seat. "We have a big turkey on Christmas, and Granny and I can never eat it all by ourselves." "We'll certainly consider it," Hermione said kindly, not wanting to put Draco on the spot. "Thank you, Andromeda." "My mommy and daddy are dead," Teddy told her seriously. "You have to come, Hermione, or I'll cry real orphan tears." Harry dropped his head into his hands. "Edward Remus! Hermione exchanged a glance with Draco, who nodded, giving her hand a squeeze. "Oh, all right. We'd be happy to join you at Andromeda for Christmas dinner, Teddy." Teddy cheered, clapping his hands, and James did the same, though no one was sure if he actually understood what he was cheering about. "You don't have to, you know," Andromeda said after a moment. "It was just to suggest—" "No, we'd love to come," said Draco firmly, cutting her off. "Thank you, Mrs. Tonks." "Oh, it's Aunt Andy to you, dear," said Andromeda warmly.